I'm Chris Lubienski, and I've been studying education policy, so it'll be a bit different from what we've talked about so far. I've been studying this for a couple of decades in the U.S., but also in other contexts. I'm particularly interested in public and private interests in education, and I'm interested in how markets are used to organize educational production and distribution. This is something that I've been looking at in a number of countries, which I'll talk about today. And so I'm not going to talk about a research study as we've been seeing up to this point. I'm going to talk more about an agenda that I've been pursuing over the last couple of decades and pursuing into the future. This is happening in a context of globalization of markets in education. People are familiar with terms like school choice, for example, or increased competition between schools. A number of policies promote these types of phenomena, including efforts to devolve governance authority away from central governments or even local governments towards consumers and for-profit and non-profit providers. So, for example, we've seen the growth of chains of schools, the Jones Academies, Ridge Academies, Omega schools across the globe. And again, these can be for-profit or non-profit types of schools. So when people talk about markets in education, they're often referring back to ideas that were promoted by thinkers like Milton Friedman in the 1950s, who saw the idea of giving parents the ability to choose schools just as they choose other consumer goods and services as having benefits, and that would be closer matches between the learning styles of the children, for example, and the different providers. It would lead to an increase in diversity of options and also increases in quality. And this argument has often been made in the context of highly segregated and uneven educational systems, where we have some excellent schools and some really poor schools, and the argument is that poor children trapped in low-performing schools should have the opportunity to choose outside of their assigned school. So that there's a lot of potential, at least on a theoretical level there, that this can liberate families that are constrained to failing schools. But there's also concerns that it can lead to greater segregation. I want to be clear here that we're not talking about pure markets by any means. Many people refer to these as quasi-markets because we have parents that aren't really spending their own money, they're making choices on behalf of somebody else. So there's a number of factors which kind of corrupt the idea of a pure market in education. That said, there's still a number of key factors here that lend towards market-type arrangements and analysis. For example, consumer-style choices there, competition between schools for the choices of those parents, and increased autonomy for schools. That is, we can't ask them to compete unless we give them the ability to try new things, pursue innovations, and that type of thing. And this is leading to competitive incentives for both individuals, parents who are pursuing those options for the kids, but also for schools. They have to compete, they're incentivized to try new things, presumably to provide better options for children. But I want to take this out of kind of more abstract and talk about this idea in a real-world context, as I'll be doing today. That markets tend to be local. People generally aren't choosing schools across wide geographic areas. Some people are when they're involved in the global economy, for example. But for the most part, parents are choosing schools based on what they can viably get their children to within a reasonable amount of time. So markets tend to be experienced. They tend to be in a lived set of viable options for families. And so these tend to be local, we call local education markets. But they also give us the opportunity to observe the strategic behavior of schools as they're competing with each other for the choices of those parents. And we'll talk about some of those strategies today, but essentially what we're doing is applying business-style logic to schools, which have traditionally been outside the purview of market incentives. And so, again, we're seeing the rise of certain business-style strategies, such as marketing, for example, or chains of schools. So this has been studied quite a bit on the demand side. How are parents making decisions about which schools to choose to go to? What I've been doing, and a few other people have been doing, looking more at the supply side. How is this affecting how schools are offering education options to different children? And we see different strategies emerging, such as competition, but also there's opportunities for cooperation between schools, or sometimes collusion, just as any market type environment. So my overall question here is, what does the architecture of markets look like? How do markets structure themselves in education? How do they operate? And then what are the equity effects? Does this in fact increase access for disadvantaged populations, or does it lead to greater segregation? And we have to recognize, of course, that these issues take place in real world contexts that often differ by policies. Policies can vary across countries and regions. Demographic contexts matter. Organizational, institutional contexts are also very important. Those will be some things I'll be talking about briefly today. But my interest there is when we look across sites, when we look in different countries as these markets are emerging, are we seeing certain commonalities? Are we seeing certain things that are universally true? Because the logic, again, is universal, assuming that people and organizations pursue their own self-interest, regardless of whether they're in South Africa or Chile or Canada. So are there these commonalities, or are there distinctions or contrasts across cases? And so what I'll be doing here, what I'll be showing you is mapping markets as we look at some of the local education markets in different cities. And again, there's opposing hypotheses here. On the one hand, opening up markets and competition might improve access for disadvantaged populations to better educational options. On the other hand, there's also concern that people will self-sort, that organizations will pursue certain types of families, and that will lead to greater levels of segregation. And I'll, in the end, talk about how we're using mapping right now, but also how we can use more qualitative data within these approaches, this methods approach. So I've been working with a number of collaborators in 4 different countries here on looking at markets in 5 different nations. And again, local education markets, not markets across whole countries. And using a mapping approach. And geographic analyses are important here because, again, people think about their options in terms of geographic proximity. How long would it take me to get my child to the school every morning? What are the different options I have within a certain radius, for example? And this has policy implications as well. People think a lot about proximity. They report that in survey data and reveal preferences and other forms of evidence. So the arrangements of those options matter a lot. Are, for example, the high-quality schools clustered in one part of the city? Are there obstacles to people making choices? A river, a freeway, things like that? Or is transportation available? And again, within those contexts, we start to see the emergence of different organizational strategies on the parts of schools. The idea of a geographic analysis, often people refer back to the 1854 cholera outbreak in London, when Dr. John Snow used a map to mark out where people were dying relative to the different sources of water. And he was able to identify a particular well on Broad Street, which presumably was the source of the outbreak. The public authorities stepped in and closed it down, and the outbreak was taken care of. That's the mythology. But that's often referred to as one of the first uses of geographic analysis. And now what's happening with using computers, we're able to layer geocoded data in doing these analyses. So for example, census data based on demographic distributions, point data based on school options, for example, students' residences, those types of things we can model within computers. And this is geographic information studies or science. Some people refer to it as science. So we label these data. It could be point, polygon data, radius in terms of the routes or distance to schools. And we're able to measure proximity, look at patterns of access. And this is widely used in many fields, economics, sociology, but also in the business world as well. McDonald's is using this when they're deciding where, or Starbucks when they're deciding where to build a new outlet. They're doing market analysis using this type of approach. Some of the advantages to this is that it takes into account the real world context. It tells us where exactly are the high traffic areas, where are the physical barriers, where are the concentrations of families with school-age children, or the concentrations of schools, for example. And so it takes those spatial factors into consideration. Some of the disadvantages is that it tends to be more descriptive than analytical, the way it's been used to this point. And it can be rather expensive. So what I'm going to talk about now is several different local education markets. As we're mapping these markets, I'll give you a sense of the policy context, and then take a look at how schools, for the most part, are responding to these competitive incentives within those markets. Auckland, New Zealand is often seen as one of the leading edge cases for using markets in education. In the late 1980s, the Labour government of New Zealand implemented a policy called Tomorrow Schools, where they essentially devolved all authority to the school level. So schools were able to make their own decisions about who to hire, what kind of curriculum to use, that type of thing. There's been fluctuations in that policy, but that's still basically the policy today, where there's essentially no local educational authorities at play there. Nonetheless, there still tends to be a relatively high level of segregation in New Zealand, growing compared to what it was a few decades ago. And the idea of choice has really been embraced by families there, particularly middle-class families, to the extent that estimates in Auckland, the largest city, is that a third of the traffic during rush hours between parents rushing their kids around the different schools. So it's pretty substantial. One important thing to note here is that they have a decile system where schools are categorized based on the socioeconomic profile of their students. It's used for compensatory purposes, but it tends to be also conflated with the idea of school quality, even though it's not meant to represent that. Parents understand that as a marker of school quality. What's interesting here is that schools in higher deciles tend to be oversubscribed. Richer schools tend to have longer waiting lists. And because of that oversubscription, they're allowed to draw their own boundaries of who has primary access to that school and who's excluded. So it gives us a really interesting case to study that organizational behavior, but whether or not those boundaries are gerrymandered, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but whether they're manipulated in a way to increase access or exclude students from schools. And so we've been doing some mapping in New Zealand here, and I don't need to explain all these maps in detail, but what we have here is representations of different types of schools across the Auckland area. We're also able to see where the boundaries are that they've drawn, where they overlap, where there's gaps that leave kids out of primary access to schools. What's interesting is looking at this relative to the actual organic radii around schools. There tends to be quite a bit of gerrymandering to the exclusion of poor children from poor communities. In some cases even, see this, you have schools that are drawing boundaries like this school here is drawing a little orbit area for itself right here. Darker green represents more advantaged populations. So they are including richer kids in these communities and jumping over the poorer kids in those communities. See, that's a more of an extreme example, but overall that tends to be the pattern, is that schools that have the ability to exclude children are doing that in Auckland. Moving to the U.S., Detroit is often said to be the most segregated city in the United States, and it's been in serious decline since the 1970s. It used to be the fourth most populated city in the U.S., and now it's not even in the top 10. And there's large areas of the city that are deserted, packs of wild dogs running around. And as it's lost that school-age population, as people have left the city, it's left with a large capacity of schools that are empty. And Michigan, the state in which Detroit is in, has also embraced neoliberal approaches such as charter schools and choice systems, a number of different choice systems, which I'll talk about in a second, and increase the autonomy for schools, giving schools the opportunity to set their own policies, for example. Detroit also had a strong tradition of Catholic schooling, so there's another system there of private schooling that tradition has been paid for by families. One interesting factor about Detroit is it was kind of the end of legal desegregation in the United States. People are familiar with Brown versus Board of Education, for example. That series of court cases kind of ended in Detroit when, in the Milliken versus Bradley decision, the U.S. Supreme Court reasoned that the suburbs around Detroit did not have to accept students from Detroit. They didn't have to be part of a larger desegregation program. And so, as I said, it's a very segregated city. And here, what you're seeing is the different districts in the area, and the darker blue districts are ones that are losing the school-age population just through the demographic shifts. Detroit itself is this area right in here. There's Hamtramck there, which is a large Polish community for race. And then you have the inner rim suburbs and outer rim suburbs. So you have a substantial shift in the population away from the inner city, which means schools are losing their students, and they'll have to close if they can't find ways of filling those seats. And as I said, Detroit is a highly segregated city. Here, the darker green represents the African-American population. Lighter green represents whiter population. And you can see really distinct boundaries there. For example, right here is the famous 8 Mile Road. On one side, it's almost completely African-American. Across the street, it's almost all white. So it's within that context that schools have been given more autonomy to pursue families. And in Michigan, the state has given districts the ability to decide whether or not they'll accept students from outside their district, but within their county. And here you see the 3 larger areas of the counties. Or from any county. They can accept students from anywhere in Michigan if they wish. But that's a decision that's made by the district. So it gives us, again, another opportunity to look at the organizational behavior of school districts, in this case, whether or not they're opening themselves up to poorer kids or whether or not they're closing their boundaries. And what I did here is mapping the policies. What you'll see is that the pink areas are districts that have opened themselves up to students within their county, so within those dark blue lines. The red districts are districts that have closed themselves off to everybody. You have to be a resident within that district in order to send your child to school there. And the green districts are opening themselves up to everybody. They're accepting students from Detroit. So again, you see this pattern of exclusion. Districts that are losing students, that need to get students in there or they're going to have to close down schools, are actually closing their boundaries rather than have kids from Detroit come into those schools, which says quite a bit. Even though they get a substantial amount of money per child, they'd rather lose employees or lose schools than accept those students. And we've also looked at Detroit in terms of charter schools. Charter schools, as you may know, are publicly funded, privately managed schools. And in Michigan, about 80% of charter schools are for-profit. They're run by for-profit businesses. So again, it gives us the opportunity to explore where charter schools are locating and where different types of charter schools are locating relative to the school population here. So here you see plus the darker blue represents the highest concentration of African American students. And here just overall distribution of charter schools. But when you start to look at different types of charter schools, you see some interesting patterns emerging. Mission-driven charter schools are nonprofit, and they tend to be more evenly distributed across the metropolitan area, including in the areas of highest need, where the for-profit charter schools do locate in the city, but they tend to ring around the areas with the highest need, therefore putting a burden on families to get their kids from the poor neighborhoods to those schools. So it's kind of a filtering device. And we see this pattern in other places as well, Kansas City, for example, Washington, D.C., where there's these ringing strategies that essentially filter out the poorest kids from these types of schools. Yeah, so these are just different representations of that. Washington, D.C. is also a city that's really embraced school choice. There's a congressionally mandated voucher program. That is, most lawmakers in the U.S. are kind of hesitant to allow for public funds going to private schools in their own jurisdiction, but they decided to use Washington, D.C. as a test case because Congress has special authority there. So there's a voucher system within Washington, D.C., and a very large charter sector. I think about 45% of the children now in Washington, D.C. go to charter schools. And there's also been some demographic changes where certain neighborhoods are becoming wealthier, and that's leading to demands for new educational options by those families. So what we did here is just look at where charter schools are locating and where they're moving. Charter schools, being newer schools, can close up shop and move to a storefront or an empty building somewhere else. And again, we're starting to see these patterns of moving from poorer areas to wealthier areas, which is cause for some concern. And you might be familiar with the New Orleans context. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, the state declared an emergency and imposed emergency powers, fired the 3,000 teachers working for New Orleans public schools, and then replaced the school system largely with a charter school system. So the local education authority was essentially disempowered. They were left with, I think it was 4 schools that they still controlled. The rest of the schools were turned essentially into charter schools. There's also a voucher system there. So again, we can map the different types of charter schools and public schools across New Orleans. And so the different icons represent different types of schools relative to the distribution of African-American residents in the area. But what we were quite interested in is what, again, is available in terms of access to families. So here we look at the admissions policies that are imposed by charter schools in different areas. And even though there's some charter schools that are located in mixed and poor areas, charter schools around those areas, represented by the red dots, impose admissions policies. Including requirements on the parents in order for their kids to apply and be enrolled in those schools. So even though they're geographically accessible to children in poorer communities, they still impose barriers in order to filter out the most disadvantaged children who presumably are most in need of educational options. A couple other cities, I won't spend a lot of time on this because we need to move forward, but in Vancouver we're seeing the rise of, again, neoliberal market-style approaches to educational governance. Different types of choice options are available to parents. And as a global city, it's very segregated, or I should say polarized in terms of ethnicity, immigration status, and also economic status. And our analyses there, we're seeing that the wealthier families tend to take more advantage of the choice options that are available to them. Because transportation costs are put onto the families, they're able to bear those costs and choose schools that are further away from home, where children from poor families here are less likely to take advantage of those options. Similar issues in Chicago. Chicago is often held up as an example of neoliberal ideals in the U.S. Highly segregated, moving away from a neighborhood system of public education, which was segregated and unequal, to an even more segregated and unequal school choice model based on charter schools. So again, looking at the locations of different types of schools. And Chicago's closed almost 60 schools recently, and we opened private schools as alternative to charter schools. And in terms of access to those schools, the changes in access is affecting largely the minority populations, African American and Hispanic families in that area, which can be quite a concern, considering there's often gang boundaries involved. That families have to send their children to schools that are further away, and they're crossing boundaries which are unsafe to cross. So just some of the working themes that have been doing these different studies, that there seems to be evidence of exclusion across these types of cases, but the way that exclusion happens differs across those cases. It does appear that choice is not equally distributed, that access to quality education is not more equally distributed because of these choice systems. But the context really is important in understanding the arrangements of those choices. And again, thinking about whether or not there's a Catholic school tradition within an area, for example, or whether or not there's historical segregation across neighborhoods, that matters. A lot of the architects of school choice policies argue that the devil is in the details, that the way we create rules really matters for whether or not we'll have equitable systems of education markets. But I think what we're seeing here is the lesson that often incentives trump those rules. Even though we can set regulations on schools about how they market themselves, how they do admissions to try and be more fair, schools and families often try finding ways around those regulations because they're incentivized to do so in a competitive market. And also the organizational form, that is whether or not a school is a state school or a private school, oftentimes that becomes irrelevant. That schools are incentivized, and so even though they might have a particular social mission in a competitive market, they often have to act like for-profit businesses in pursuing more advantaged students. So these are some of the basic geographic analysis we've been doing. In the future, I'll be looking more at other types of sites outside more developed countries, for example, and also different types of local education markets that represent different models of markets and education. But also what I'm trying to do is incorporate more qualitative data into these mapping exercises. They tend to be based more on statistical data from the census, the U.S. Census, for example, or other census organizations, or using indicators of school quality. But what we're finding, what also matters is not just the empirical evidence, the hard evidence that researchers often use, but parents' perceptions matter quite a bit. And being able to model those perceptions within maps is going to be really important. So for example, census data might show us where you have areas of high crime, but parents' perceptions of where those areas of high crime are, whether or not it's a safe school, might matter more when they're deciding where to send their child to school. So asking parents through, for example, interviews how they're constructing their sets of choices for their children matters quite a bit. And this has been a critique of a lot of the geographic approaches, is that it tends to be ignoring those perspectives, ignoring the lived experiences and perceptions of family members. And so, so what I'm trying to do is use GIS as a platform for more of a mixed methods approach to modeling these markets. That is not just a bird's eye view of sitting in front of my computer using census data, but also an on-the-ground experience of how parents understand the viability of different choices that may or may not be available to them. So some examples of how we're starting to do this, for example, in Melbourne, Australia, we've been mapping this and asking parents about how they're making these choices or what do they see as the sets of choices for their students. Australia has a kind of subtle choice system where state schools, Catholic schools, and independent schools all get state funding, and so parents are able to choose across different sectors without regard to whether or not they're able to necessarily pay out of pocket, although sometimes even state schools have substantial fees they impose on parents. But we're asking how parents kind of create the menu of choices of schools they see that are available for their children. And what's interesting here is our interview data is suggesting these choices aren't set up just by location. That is, people don't just think, well, this school is 5 minutes away, or this school is, within a half-hour drive. But those choice sets are also informed quite a bit by the socioeconomic status of the families and also their immigration status. So people are self-identifying as belonging to a certain group and wanting to send their kids to that school, whether or not it's proximate to them. And also, middle-class parents are more likely to demand the creation of new schools in their area if they don't see a viable option for their own child. That is, even in the past, if there was a comprehensive school right next to them, if they see that as serving kids that are not their own children, they want to go to the school. Similar things are happening in Chicago, where we're asking parents about the changes in the sets of schools that are available to them and modeling that. And even, this is an example from Vancouver, we're asking students to draw the maps, show us what their neighborhood looks like, what's the safe area, what the different school options are within their area. So on the left you see a map from an 11-year-old boy. And I don't know if you can see the map on the right so much from a young girl who was drawing her neighborhood. So anyways, in conclusion, this gives us some new opportunities in order to explore the organizational behavior of schools and districts, other education authorities within these new competitive markets to explore the ways that they can be more equitable or ways that they might be using their new autonomy towards ways to exclude students. So that said, feel free to get in touch with any questions. Yeah.
I was going to make a comment. When you mentioned Vancouver, excuse me, big word. Excuse me, when you mentioned Vancouver, there's another aspect of Vancouver I think you may have not interjected, and that is when Hong Kong evacuated, so to speak, Vancouver was the largest recipient of Chinese from Hong Kong. I think San Francisco was the next, and that changed dramatically the culture of Vancouver. There's another Canadian one which you didn't bring in, and that's Quebec. Because in Quebec right now, because of the French and English, and French now being the priority language in Quebec, although it's...
Are you talking about Quebec City or the province?
Top of the province.
Okay.
Top of the province. That anybody coming into the province of Quebec with children from another culture, from the United States, they're required them to go to a French-speaking school. And then they're divided, as you know, by Protestant French, Catholic French, and so on. So there are other considerations in how people make decisions.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily in a neighborhood, but coming from other cultures and trying to integrate, and not setting up little enclaves with a particular culture from their country, but getting absorbed into the culture of a particular environment.
Right. Quebec's an interesting case that I've avoided because of the language issues there, that, where they have special autonomy over language policy. But Toronto is another city that's become a global city. You're right about Vancouver and Hong Kong, but also Toronto has seen a large influx of East Asian populations as well. Interesting area to explore. But no, we're quite aware of that in our analysis of Vancouver. Thank you.
It's amazing though, but just as an aside, when you think of people who have educational opportunities, and think of the African continent, and how many people are living in small environments, and how many geniuses really are in that nation with no opportunity to contribute to society and to the world at large with a skill for which they have capacity and educational background.
But Africa has become a site for large penetration by market forces, whereas Liberia, for example, has brought in bridge academies funded by the Gates Foundation and other groups to basically run a large section of the school system. Uganda as well with bridge academies. So a lot of those countries are looking to the private sector to step in where they see public sector failure up to that point in Africa.
Thank you very much. Yes, do you have questions? Yes.
Chris, thank you for sharing your research with us. That was quite interesting to hear a little bit more about charter school demographics. The question I have for you might be a little bit outside of the scope of your research, but I'm interested to know your perspective. You shared with us a business model, and I think we know that businesses thrive when people want or demand or perceive that there's quality in a product. And I think some of the research that I'm familiar with shows that many of the charter schools in the US context are actually failing. And they don't provide, for example, adequate services to students with special needs, be it for English as a second language or other amenities that the public schools might offer. So I wonder, once families have made the choice to move to charter schools, are they kind of stuck? Do they not really have any more choice anymore if they wound up in a school where the quality is perhaps not what they perceived when they made that choice?
And just to say, we talk about charter schools in the US, but really it's a very diverse sector. There's some excellent charter schools and there's some miserable charter schools, just the same with public schools as well. So there's a number of issues with the question. The business model is that when people run a firm, a for-profit firm, they usually have a certain menu of options to choose. They can compete on price, they can compete on quality. There's different ways of competing. When we apply that logic to schools, it gets corrupted to some extent. Schools can't really compete based on price. They can impose costs, though, on parents through things like where they decide to locate or whether or not there's fees involved or uniforms. So they can do that. But they're often competing based on who attends the school. And if you have a student profile that has fewer minorities, although Asian students might increase the profile, those are ways of competing. And we're seeing that actually in the marketing that matters quite a bit. But as far as being stuck, parents say that they choose schools based on quality. A lot of surveys suggest that they preference academic quality as the most important factor. But research also suggests when they actually look for schools, race is one of the first things they look at. And a lot of the research suggests that parents are choosing schools in many cases that are demonstrably academically inferior, but more segregated. So they're choosing to send their kids to schools that are worse, but have other students that look more like their own child.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you have mentioned that, but I understood that your study concerns primary schools?
No.
What level of the school is that?
These are all K through 12, so primary and secondary.
Primary and secondary. Have you considered looking at the pattern of the choice of ECC centers? We know from the study conducted in Europe 3 years ago that the reasons for choosing particular settings vary depending on the age of children and the level of education. Does it vary between primary and secondary schools?
Yeah, and even pre-primary in the U.S. There's a very vibrant market for early childhood education in a number of cities. We see a lot of advertising, a lot more for-profit provision, and so that's a very dynamic market, which I haven't taken into account here. And also at the tertiary level as well. We know that our institutions compete in many ways. But yeah, typically people are making choices for their children at the beginning of primary years and at the beginning of secondary years when they do school transition. So that's where these studies are focused. But I appreciate your suggestions.
If you don't have any more questions, then thank you. Please.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'll do my best not to shorten your coffee break too much. My name is Olga Złowska and I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education. I'm also a former kindergarten teacher and lower primary school teacher. Most of the presentations that we heard yesterday and today concerned school-age children and school professionals, and I will focus on a completely different sector, meaning the children at the age of 23 and the provision for these children, more specifically the quality of provision for the youngest children. I will present the first results of a study conducted in 4 European countries. How and under what conditions does quality in early childhood education care matter? A study across 4 European countries. So very briefly about the project framework, I have already mentioned the title. The participants of the project are researchers from Portugal, Finland, the Netherlands and Poland. The primary investigator and the leader of the consortium is Joanna Karima from Porto University. The Dutch University, Utrecht University, is represented by Colin Slot. The Finnish Jyväskylä University by Jenny Salminen and Maria Kristina Lerkanen. And I'm leading our small unit in Warsaw University, supported by my promoter, Professor Małgorzata Karczewska-Struczek. The project duration is foreseen for 3 years. We started in May 2016 and plan to finish in May 2019. Importantly, in Europe, a growing number of young children is enrolled in different forms of ECC provision. What makes these non-familiar educare experiences an increasingly important context for their development. For instance, in Poland, within the last 5 years, the participation rate of children up to the age of 3 has risen from approximately 2 up to 10%. It's still one of the lowest in Europe. However, the numbers are growing very, very fast. That makes also the fastest growing sector of education in our national system and creates a great demand for professionals who would be qualified to work with these youngest children. This trend is reflected in the interest of policymakers and researchers searching for effective but also culturally sensitive solutions which would be supportive for ECC stakeholders in establishing high quality provision to all children. Since we know that the high quality ECC provision is extremely important for children's further outcomes such as school performance, especially for children from disadvantaged families. Hence, we made the quality the crucial concept of our research project. From literature, we know that the quality is most frequently described as consisting of two major aspects: the structural quality that has already been mentioned in the previous presentation, which includes features such as curriculum, the teacher education, teacher-to-child ratio, but also the environment within the setting. And these structural characteristics are considered to be the precondition for the other, the most important aspect of general quality, meaning the process quality. And the process quality are the dynamic aspects of the classroom, including teacher-child interactions, curriculum implementation, peer interactions, and relations. Also referring to the comment that we had within the last presentation, I think all of us can imagine really fantastically in terms of architecture prepared building for children as a setting where nothing good is going on. This is about the relation of people who are in the setting. But at the same time, we can imagine a building that is not prepared well, but still, due to very good relations of people being in the building, there is something really good going on. So we know that this precondition structure may effectively support process quality. However, this process quality is the one related in up-to-date research with children outcomes and further performance. So most of these up-to-date research that I mentioned were conducted in the United States. So with our study, we would like to expand the understanding of the quality concept, process quality concept, by research in European context, in different national European countries with different policy systems, but also pedagogical traditions. Importantly, in most of the settings for children up to the age of 3 or 4 that varies across Europe, there are no specific curricula to work with children. Usually there are some general guidance who lead professionals in their day-to-day work with the youngest. What we additionally would like to do, except exploring the quality in general itself, is to look at the quality provided to children within particular type of activities which are typical for the settings for the youngest. As there is no curriculum, we decided to look on what is actually going on in most of these centers. So by the study in Poland now, we conducted observations in 30 public settings for children from 0 up to the age of 3, more specific in groups of 2 and 3-year-olds. In each classroom, 4 types of activities were observed, meaning routines such as meals, arts, including crafts and musical activities, pre-academic activities, such as pre-literacy activities, for example, reading, and what was already mentioned? Free play. Okay. Participants were the convenience sample. Nevertheless, the selection of centers was aiming at capturing the national variation of centers in terms of size of the centers, the teacher-to-child ratio, and the general environment of the provision. Importantly, these regulations in Poland are very strict, meaning that there are 16 square meters that are to be in the settings for 5 children and additional 2.5 meters per every child above that number. So the architectural environment in that sense is quite alike among the settings. Of course, the interiors vary. Still, there should be, in bigger centers, separate room for children to sleep, and there should be a special area for feeding. A bit about the tool that was used. We have decided to use increasingly used in Europe, also, but mostly in the United States classroom assessment scoring system. And about the procedure, we videotape activities within 2 mornings in each setting. Then we chose clips for further analysis, which met the requirements concerning the type of activity, length, and the technical quality We could not use the microphones with the youngest children, so the quality of sound necessary for scoring the video clips were important. If there were more situations meeting the requirements, we were always choosing the first one that was recorded in each of the settings. So a bit more about the class itself, the toddler version of the tool, because there are versions of the tool foreseen for each level of education, consists of two overarching domains of quality. The first one is emotional and behavioral support domain, which includes 5 dimensions. And the second domain is the engaged support for learning, which includes 3 dimensions concerning support of children learning and the language competences. All of these dimensions were scored on a 7-point scale and further aggregated. The results were aggregated on the domain level and then according to the marking to the general indicator of quality within the setting. So I would like to just very briefly show you the results. We know from up-to-date research that based on the class toddler version, not much, there is not a lot of them still. Nevertheless, the inquiry conducted in several national contexts shows the overall pattern needs to high level of emotional and behavioral support and low to mid levels of engaged support for learning. We can see in the slides that the same pattern occurred in Poland, and we were very happy about it because it was a big question for us what is actually going on in those centers. In 2011, we had a great shift concerning this sector of education, meaning that it was moved from the supervision of Ministry of Health to the Ministry of Family, Labour and Social Policy. And nobody knew how this change, which was rather rapid, would influence what is going on in the settings. So it occurred that the general quality provided by our professionals is comparable to the results that we gained from other countries. What was more interesting for us was to look at the dimension level and the domain level in reference to different types of activities offered to children. We could see that the patterns were the same, however the difference occurred, especially in terms of the meal activities and pre-academic activities. So looking at the domain level, we could see that the free play activities and creative provided children with a bit higher quality in terms of behavioral and emotional support, whereas engaged support for learning was the lowest during the meals. That may seem not to be surprising, but this project is an extension of a previous European big project conducted in 7 European countries. And for example, in Italy, I think we all know the customs of Italian meals, which are very, let's say, enthusiastic on many occasions, occurred to be the highest during the meal activities, both in terms of behavioral and emotional support and engaged support for learning. What tells us that actually these routine activities may be great opportunities for children to learn. So looking, yes?
Can I just ask a quick question, if you could go back to the slide?
This one.
Provide a little bit more information on how you distinguish between the behavioral and emotional support and engagement for learning in free play. Like how would you distinguish between the two, where you would observe an activity and say it's high in emotional and behavioral support, but it's not really engaging the kids in learning? An example?
The class measure very specifically provides information on the type of behavior that should occur during the evaluated clip within each of these dimensions. So, for example, positive climate refers to the eye contact that is kept between the teacher and children and the relations between themselves. The teacher sensitivity tells us, for example, if the teacher sees the child sitting in the corner during the whole of the activity and is not participating in the activity. Quality of feedback from the other domain, for example, tells us if the teacher who's working on arts and crafts with children is using feedback such as "super, it was great," or "Kasia, I think it's really nice, I really like the way that you colored the house." So it's the level of complexity of feedback that children receive. Actually, it took me quite a lot of time to master the way of scoring these clips, and the procedure is very strict. So we had to meet the interoperability agreement with the other researcher, and then we also met the interoperability with international researchers. We have subtitled several clips randomly chosen to see if the scores which we gave to particular clips are meeting the 80% of reliability. So altogether, the 5 dimensions of the emotional and behavioral support, those are aggregated scores of these 5 dimensions, and in terms of engaged support for learning, of the 3 dimensions on the right.
So for engaged support for learning through free play, it's fairly interpretive. So there's not like there is, because it's free play, so it's not like there's a specific set of learning objectives that you're looking for. It's whatever the child chooses to do in that instance. Let's say
And how
based on it's how the teacher actually goes over and whatever the child is engaging in, the quality of the feedback that's given in that specific activity.
Yes.
So it's kind of dependent on the scorer, the evaluator, to determine based on the activity if that level of feedback is high, medium, low.
Yes, although there are very specific examples in the manual telling which way of structuring the feedback is scored on what level.
Okay.
So also language modeling. If, for example, there is a new term that occurs in the conversation with children, or the teacher notices that the children do not understand this or that context from the book, does the teacher explain it in a way that we can see that children understand it? So there are several, within each of these dimensions, there are other distinctions between different categories. Each of them is again scored on low, mid, and high level. Then we aggregated getting to the general result. The procedure is very strict, and we just follow the manual that was built for it. So what we looked at were these results in relation to the particular type of activities. We have to remember that, for example, meals, which occur to be the least educational one, let's say, for children, they take a lot of time to crash. We had children, in Poland we have from 4 up to 5 meals a day in the setting, meaning that children spend up to 20% within these activities. If we find out that these activities are completely meaningless for them in terms of learning opportunities, that's something that's a clear guidance on what we should work on. And here also importantly, within that shift in 2011, our government also decided that kindergarten and lower primary school teachers are entitled to work with babies and toddlers, what gives us as teacher educators additional responsibility for preparing them to work with these youngest children. And that requires, in my opinion, specific modules in pre-service training programs, and of course in-service training offered for those who are already qualified teachers. This is the most fastly expanding market for teachers now in Poland. Yes, we know that we have population decline and there are some school closing, but at the same time, places for work in these settings for the youngest children are occurring very rapidly in all across the country. So it occurred also that these differences within the particular dimensions and domains related to different types of activities are significant, even in the small sample. So we, for example, see on the domain level that behavioral and emotional support is higher during free play and creative activities compared to pre-academic activities. Engaged support for learning is higher during pre-academic activities compared to meals. But what is interesting that these patterns do not occur in other countries. So the question is, in what ways these activities are organized that they manage to get high results in these activities that we are not? We also looked at the settings which gained the best results within particular type of activities, trying to find some more qualitative insights. How do they do that? That the general results are higher. And actually what we noticed, that the organization and the way, for example, of organizing the lunchroom has a big influence on the quality of experiences of children during these meals. So I completely agree that these architectural features may be crucial for supporting these good relations between children and adults and peers. The same on the dimension level, when we looked more closely at particular dimensions, we saw that the positive climate is higher during free play than pre-academic activities, which, for example, we know from very initial data from the Netherlands is opposite to Poland. And that regard for child perspective is higher during free play, creative and meals than during pre-academics, free play than meals. Facilitation of learning and development is higher during pre-academic activities than meal. Of course, there are limitations of this study. It's a small sample size which does not allow for generalization of the findings. However, that's the first study conducted in Poland with such a small children in the setting, so we hope that it will initiate further research in this field. Additionally, also the selected settings are not necessarily representative for the common practices in the country, but I think it will be very, very hard to find representative sample in the country, as the networks of creches, public creches in Poland, are governed by the municipalities. And I traveled across the country visiting the different networks, and I have to say that the differences between Warsaw, let's say, and the Netherlands is smaller than Warsaw and Łódź, which is 100 kilometers from here. They are so locally influenced by educators, their previous experiences and conditions of work that it is crucial for what we see in the settings. As an example, I can say that for now there are no group size limitations in terms of 0 to 3. So we saw 45 children, 45 2-year-old groups in Łódź, whereas in Warsaw they are rather 20. So it makes a huge difference for what is going on in the classroom. So the next steps are, we would like to relate our findings with the same reports which were also gathered among caregivers on the curriculum of provided activities, more specific the frequency of providing, organizing different types of activities for children in the settings. Professionals' job satisfaction and the organizational climate, which were indicated in the previous research to be crucial in terms of ECC centers, shaping ECC centers' practices. We also want to see, using a measure of children and professionals' engagement in particular type of activities, such as, for example, the time that children have hands-on materials, or they're using some demonstrations within the pre-academic activities, and how does it relate to the quality results. And what is also very important, we will need to investigate the cultural sensitivity of the class cover tool. I can tell you as an example, referring also to meals that have already been mentioned, that in Poland for decades it was rude to talk during the meals. Children were to sit quietly, and I even saw the example in the creche settings where they started the meal with a sequence. So what do we do with our mouth? We close it. What do we do with our hands? What do we do with our legs? And they started the meal. So evaluating language modeling within an activity that is organized like that is something completely different. So this division into activities within the evaluation seems to be reasonable. I think I mentioned the conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to make one comment, because you mentioned something which feeds into my approach to designing schools. We approach it in 3 categories: social, mental, environmental. When you mentioned food services at the cafeteria, that probably gets the highest level of attention from us, because putting something in your mouth is a very, very personal thing. God knows what happens in people's homes when children eat or throw food around or whatever. And so we designed the cafeterias as though it was a 5-star Michelin restaurant, where the environment is good, the light comes in, the furniture is good, people behave, the social interaction is tremendous, and you ultimately get that emotional support from child to child. So I was glad to hear that you mentioned that one aspect, which feeds into the narrative of our social, mental, and environmental considerations of putting pencil to paper, so to speak.
We noticed that the highest results during meals occur in the centers where actually teachers sit with children.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is rather rare in Polish conditions. So when they actually, due to our sanitary regulations, they can't eat with children, but even though they are sitting with them by the same table, it increases the quality.
You know, just as an example, there's a school I did in Manhattan. There's an island in the East River called Roosevelt Island. And if you're on the island, you have a spectacular panorama of Manhattan with all the towers and so on. And we forced the issue, the parents didn't like it at first. We put the cafeteria right at the edge of the river. So the children had lunch with this gorgeous panorama and no discipline, no food throwing, no yelling and screaming this, enjoying the environment, and it's very encouraging to maintaining the quality of the academic environment, because that's a part of it, as something to which they look forward in interacting with their fellow students.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Let me now use my power and microphone, because I have my own comment. I was once visiting Italian preschools in Bologna, and the most striking thing about the Italian preschools for me was not related to teaching, learning. It was the organization of the space. Because the typical Polish preschool is organized as typical Polish school is organized, which is the military barracks is the closest analogy, with every class, is assigned to a certain room, yes, and in the Italian preschool, no room belongs to anybody. I mean, because the rooms have their functions as in normal life. You know, there is a place we eat in, there's a place we play, there's a place we gather to plan our day, and so on. So it struck me as such a very simple thing that we are not thinking about, you know, getting our kids to preschool every day. That it's so.
I think I have also a comment on that, because we did not go to preschools. We were in crash settings.
Yeah.
And these settings are not so highly regulated in terms of the environment, except the number of square meters and the number of rooms. And because of lack of those regulations, I think that professionals use their heads when planning the environment, and they are way better organized. I'm sorry, but that is true. If you visit Polish preschools, they all look completely the same. This is outstanding that children are told not to run, but there's huge space in the middle. So why not to run? I mean, it's, I think, post-communist thing.
Do you have more question? If not, then let's have a coffee break. And